I have a few things I want to talk about today. I want to talk about the causes of the war, map the structure of the conflict, and then talk about some war termination scenarios and finding solutions, and then summarize. The causes of the war, there are multiple causes of the war, obviously. It's not just one thing that's caused the war. Thinking back to February 2022 when Hamish began at his job here, we have Russian imperialism as kind of this overarching factor. Intersecting with that is Ukrainian interest in independence and democracy moving toward the West. We have Western expansion or enlargement of NATO and the EU to the exclusion of Russia. And then we have the precipitating factors from that time of February 2022. Putin coming out of COVID isolation, getting ready to celebrate his 70th birthday. There's a thing about him turning 70. The average lifespan in Russia for men is in the early 50s. Mm-hmm. And so that he would live this long and celebrate this round birthday, as you say in Russian, in a big way. He was facing elections in 2024. There was also kind of a rising global South anger with the West, U.S. and NATO withdrawal, the U.S. withdrawal from NATO, from Afghanistan. So presenting an opening for Putin in international relations with the U.S. withdrawal in general. So there are a few small things going on, but there are three big factors that I think caused the war. And the most important is Russian imperialism. And I will just say that I was studying in the Soviet Union in the spring of 1990, and then from 1991 to 1992, I was studying Soviet constitutional law during the year that the Constitution, during the year that the Soviet Union collapsed. So there was no more constitution. But in the fall of 1991, as a student, I was living in a Soviet dorm, and there wasn't any sugar in Leningrad because of the economic collapse. So we're experiencing hyperinflation. I'm, standing in line with my ration coupons every day instead of going to school because there wasn't any food. And I don't know if Ruben remembers this, but the problem of sugar was a grave one. And
toilet paper.
And toilet paper was there weren't ration coupons for that either. But so I wanted to get ready for Thanksgiving holidays in November, and that was not possible without sugar. So a few of us took a train down to Kyiv because we heard that the Ukrainians had sugar. Most of the sugar in the Soviet Union was being produced in Ukraine. And so we took a train down, and that's when Ukraine was having its big independence rallies, trying to become independent from the Soviet Union. And I wrote this postcard to my mother that she found and showed to me shortly after the war began. She dug it out and showed it to me, and I was horrified at what I'd written to her as a 22-year-old from Ukraine. I said, "The political scene here is tense. Ukraine wants to break with Russia. Hopefully it won't. I think it would be a bad idea for both countries economically and spiritually." So this was the essential expression of Russian imperialism, right? It's a bad idea for Ukraine to be separate, that it should stay with Russia, that it would be unwise for Ukrainians to separate. The Russian imperial view was so strong. I mean, I don't know if you remember back to George W. Bush's Chicken Kiev speech. He was saying the same thing. A lot of Americans who were studying the Soviet Union thought at the time that Ukraine was maybe not really a real country. We bought the Russian Kool-Aid, right? That the language wasn't a real language. This is what I learned in school. that Ukraine didn't have a real culture. I mean, this was basically what outside of the Soviet culture, and so we thought that it would be a bad idea for Ukraine to separate, and that was wrong, both empirically and ethically, I would argue right now. So Ukraine has a long history of trending toward independence and democracy. The Ukrainian language dates back to the Middle Ages. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this timeline, but just to say that Ukraine has been fending off external invaders from the Mongols, Lithuania, Poland, has plenty of historical revolutionaries, important cultural figures. I'll note, I have two passports. I have a French passport, also an American. And Voltaire in the mid-1700s said, "L'Ukraine a toujours aspiré à être libre." Ukraine has always aspired to be free. Even in the mid-1700s, French intellectuals knew that this was a trend in history, that it wasn't, that one would think that it might not have taken quite so long for Ukraine to become independent, but it took this long for a variety of reasons, starting with the outlaw of Ukrainian language under Tsarist Russia. We have, of course, parts of Ukrainian history. I will take up an hour going through all of these points, and I don't want to do that. But I just want to say that there were decisive moves made by Russia and the Soviet Union to suppress Ukrainian culture, to suppress Ukrainian political elites, economic elites, actually to do away with them during the Holodomor, an entire generation of economic, political, and cultural elites. And that made it very difficult for Ukraine to move out of the sphere of Russia. We have some things that come up quite frequently now. When Khrushchev transferred Crimea to Ukraine in 1954, the Chernobyl explosion, the USSR's withdrawal from Africa, and then Ukrainian independence in 1991, when Ukrainians voted overwhelmingly in a referendum for independence, even in Crimea. Crimea voted to become an autonomous republic within Ukraine, but nevertheless to stay in Ukraine and not remain in the Soviet Union or in a union with Russia necessarily. We have in 2003 the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and then the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and this was the start of what we call the color revolutions of countries in the former Soviet Union trying to separate from Russia's sphere of influence after the end of the Soviet Union. In 2013, we have in 2008, we have Georgia and Ukraine asking to join NATO, and George W. Bush actually proposing that this happen. And in return, Russia attacked Georgia in 2008, just to kind of keep that in mind. Various steps in Ukrainian history bringing us to where we are now. I want to talk about the East European partnerships in a moment, because I think that was quite decisive in Russia's decision to eventually annex Crimea and support the separatists in Luhansk and Donetsk in their movement for independence from Ukraine. So we have this trend of Ukraine. So we have two big historical forces: Russian imperialism, Ukrainian interest over time in separating and becoming independent. And then we have this third big historical trend of European expansionism to the exclusion of Russia. So we had in 2013 the East European Partner Agreements, where basically every country along the border between Russia and Europe was asked to join in an economic agreement. And then we have the November 2013 EU meeting where Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, had originally pledged to sign the East European Partnership, but then went to the meeting and did not sign, and instead agreed to a deal with Putin, favoring to receive a $15 billion aid package from Russia. So Yanukovych had been moving toward, and Ukraine had been moving toward signing these agreements. And then at this meeting, he pulled away and backed toward Russia, because there was the idea that either Ukraine could go with Europe or with Russia, but there was no way to move in both directions at the same time. And so just so we see what this looks like on the map, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had already become a part of the EU. And the other 6 countries, so it's 9 countries altogether, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan. So all of these countries were either had joined with the EU or were asked to join the EU, but not Russia. So there was no political strategy for thinking about how to handle Russia in this setting. And that, I remember at the time, some of my Russian friends saying, what do you mean the Europeans want to ask Azerbaijan to join an economic union with the European Union and not Russia? How does that make sense? How can that be a logical move? And my answer is I don't really know. I mean, from what I understand, and I've been asking this question for quite a while, a lot of the Europeans who were designing this agreement were either in lawyers or economists, but not necessarily diplomats or politicians. So it was not a move that was driven by a political or a diplomatic kind of strategic idea. It was more of a bureaucratic, legal, and economic plan that didn't take into account how Russia might respond. And boy, did Russia not respond well, right? So we had this, Russia's violence in Ukraine began not in relation to NATO expansion. The violence happened in relation to EU expansion. It was EU enlargement that when Yanukovych refused to sign, that brought all the Ukrainians, a huge swath of the population out to the Maidan. And then this oversized security response that destroyed the demonstrations and half of the square in February 2014. And that's when we had the annexation of Crimea forcefully by Russian troops and the little green men in Luhansk and Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. So just to remind us about NATO expansion for a moment, NATO has also been enlarging, moving toward Russia over the course, and they didn't update this one. So this is before Sweden and Finland joined, but obviously they've joined NATO now. So NATO steadily moving toward Russia's borders, with Putin, even though NATO is a defensive alliance and NATO has never talked about going to war with Russia. NATO was designed, as Lord Ismay said, to keep Russia out, the Americans in and the Germans down. This expansion as a defensive alliance was not supposed to be in opposition to Russia, but again, that's how does Russia perceive it. So these are the NATO members over time. And I'll also note that Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin all asked to join NATO. And the answer was always no. But it wasn't always clear exactly the logic, right? So why the answer was no. And I still don't think we have a very good idea of why, other than Russia is huge and not as clearly democratic as most of the other countries that have joined NATO. I think those are the main reasons. But obviously under Gorbachev and Yeltsin, Russia was trending democratic. And early in the Putin years, it still was until Putin shifted. So to summarize so far, I'm arguing that Russian imperialism is the heart of the problem. Ukraine has been moving away and should have independence on its own terms. And Western institutional enlargement expansion coupled with Russian exclusion from those institutions contributed to the conflict. So we have three big forces contributing to the war. In terms of the structure of the conflict, I would argue that there are three levels of conflict that we're looking at here. There's the separatists in eastern Ukraine, and they're in an asymmetric dyad with the government of Ukraine. So they're smaller, is to say that there's this level of conflict here within Ukraine. There's a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. This is where the violence is. Most of the violence is between Ukraine and Russia right now. It's an interstate war between Russia and Ukraine. And then there's another level of conflict between Russia and the West. And Putin likes to say that he is at war not with Ukraine, but with the West. So he either frames the violence as a war with the West, or in 2014 to 2022, it was simply a domestic civil war within Ukraine. So Putin, in his rhetoric, is always ignoring or wants to downplay this conflict between Ukraine and Russia. I'll just put that out there. He does not want to acknowledge Ukraine. Why he will not negotiate with Zelensky directly, why he never wants to talk directly with Zelensky. He only wants to talk with Trump or other negotiators, or say that the problem is just here within Ukrainian domestic politics. So we have at each level the weaker party appealing to the stronger party in the next level up. So the separatists rely on Russia for support, and Ukraine relies on the West for support. And this is how we have this balancing of power dynamic. So the weaker party at each level appeals to the stronger party in the next level up in order to try to balance power. Generally, in theory, when you have a balance of power, you're more likely to have a negotiated settlement. We don't have power balancing here. There is no contest between Russia and the West. The West, if you look at the size of the EU or the size of NATO, the military and economic might of the West it dwarfs Russia's. And saying Russia is about 3 times larger than Ukraine in terms of the military and the economy, and the population for that matter. And then, of course, the government of Ukraine is much larger than the separatists' faction. So in order to solve the war, there are kind of 3 levels at which one would try to end it. So any solution would have to take into account the drivers of the conflict as well as its structure. So what are the policy options, and what should policymakers do? And I would love to hear from you on this too. I'm going to venture a kind of pie in the sky idea. We'll see what you think about it. I won't take offense if you think it's crazy. And then we can have a conversation. So I'll just say a few things related to my previous work. So when you have the promise of peacekeepers help belligerents come to negotiated settlements. So we have a whole bunch of studies that show that during negotiations, if there's a promise of third-party monitors, especially if there's enforcement, third-party external enforcement, you're more likely to come to a peace agreement. And there's also far more studies than this that show that third-party peacekeepers help to keep the peace. So once there's a peace agreement, it's more likely to hold if there are peacekeepers helping to enforce the agreement. So just to hold that in the background, part of the research I've been conducting this year is trying to figure out which institutions have regulated interstate disputes. The UN Security Council has actually been quite proficient at regulating disputes between states. So we've had very few wars between states since World War II. 123 times there have been wars that have started to escalate between states, and almost all of those disputes went to the council and were resolved, and we never hear about it. And that's the history of interstate war. You can count the number of wars between states on less than 2 hands since World War II. It's not the case for civil wars. The UN is probably not the organization at this time for this conflict, in part because the Trump administration just decided to defund the UN, and the US House has voted in favor of defunding the United Nations. So there won't be US funding to the UN. We'll see if it passes the Senate, but most likely it will. We can talk about that also. The OSCE has had from 2014 to 2022 an unarmed monitoring mission. Russia doesn't want to work with the OSCE. NATO is probably not the best organization to conduct peacekeeping. And so Michael Hanlon at the Brookings Institution and I have proposed a different organization. We're calling it the Atlantic Asian Security Community. We started to talk about something like this in the session right before now. A new kind of alliance. Maybe there is a new kind of alliance to be had that is more inclusive. So with the goals of protecting Ukraine and enabling domestic reform in Ukraine, deterring an aggressive Russia, but also some kind of an organizational framework that might enable Russian reformers, with the idea of securing a long-term peace with Ukraine and between Russia and Ukraine, and between Russia and the broadly defined West. So to come up with some kind of institutional solution, that's not possible right now with Putin, probably. But that might one day hold out a hand to the next generation of Russian leaders in a way that NATO never could. So some of the key features of this organization would be to supervise and deploy international troops now if there's a peace agreement. Members could come from both the East and the West. Members would have to pledge to uphold the sovereign borders of Ukraine. And then there would also be this idea of including Russia after the end of its imperial foreign policy. I'll just note that all of the empires in Europe used to be empires, and Europe is fine without being imperial anymore. I mean, there are manifestations of imperialism, but you don't have Bulgaria taking over its entire territory, or France, or any of the land empires, the Prussian Empire, pushing its borders outward. Those empires have ended in a variety of different ways, and I honestly believe that the Russian Empire will end one day. I don't know when. It's anachronistic that the Russian imperial idea still exists. But I do think, I have to believe it will end one day. Okay, and I'll just note, in Russian history, when there have been negative outcomes in wars, there's been massive domestic change in Russia. So in 1856, with the defeat in the Crimean War, that was the end of serfdom, slavery in Russia. The Russo-Japanese War, the First Revolution, the Second Revolution, Gorbachev in 1989. There is a pattern of massive change in Russia after war defeats. And of course, the empires of Europe ended. So to summarize, Russian imperialism is the key driver, but exclusion of Russia from institutions is a part of the picture. I think that it is incumbent on all of us not to allow Ukraine to fall to Russian imperialism. To change borders by force in this day and age, to make that something that is normalized and acceptable, is dangerous for every single state in the world. Third-party observers and peacekeepers have been effective, and so we're proposing a different kind of security architecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Please.